In a small village called Ile-Ife, nestled deep in the heart of Nigeria, life was simple but hard. The villagers relied on farming, trading, and the blessings of the gods to survive. The air was always filled with the sounds of children playing, women chatting as they pounded yam, and men discussing the latest village news under the shade of the big iroko tree. It was a close-knit community where everyone knew everyone, and life moved at a slow, steady pace. In this village lived a young woman named Amina. She was known for her beauty and her kind heart. Amina had recently married a kind and hard-working man named Tond. Their love was the talk of the village, and everyone believed they were destined for a happy life. Tond was a farmer who worked tirelessly to provide for his young wife, and Amina was a devoted homemaker who took pride in keeping their small mud house neat and welcoming. When Amina became pregnant, the entire village rejoiced. The elders blessed her, and the women offered advice on how to care for herself and the baby. Tond was overjoyed at the thought of becoming a father. He would often sit by the fire at night, dreaming of the future and the family they would build together. But fate had other plans. The day Amina went into labor, the village midwife, Momankechi, was called to assist. The labor was long and difficult, but finally, Amina gave birth to a baby girl. The room was filled with joy as Momankechi cleaned the baby and wrapped her in a soft cloth. But as she handed the baby to Amina, she noticed something unusual. The baby's eyes did not respond to light. Momankechi's face grew serious as she examined the child more closely. "Amina," she said gently, "there is something you need to know. Your daughter, she cannot see. She is blind." Amina's heart sank. She looked down at her baby, so small and innocent, and felt a wave of emotions, love, fear, and sadness all at once. Tond, who had been waiting anxiously outside, was called in. When he heard the news, he too was devastated. In a village where survival depended on hard labor and physical strength, a blind child was seen as a burden. The days that followed were filled with mixed emotions. Amina and Tond loved their daughter dearly and named her Adanna, which means her father's daughter. But the reality of their situation weighed heavily on them. The villagers, though kind, could not hide their pity. Some even whispered that Adanna's blindness was a curse from the gods. Tond, already weakened by a mysterious illness that had plagued him for months, grew weaker by the day. He tried to continue working on the farm, but his body could no longer keep up. One evening, as the sun set over the village, Tond collapsed in the fields. He was carried home, but there was nothing anyone could do. He passed away that night, leaving Amina a young widow with a blind daughter. Amina's grief was overwhelming. She had lost her husband, her partner, and the father of her child. The weight of her sorrow, combined with the harsh judgment of the villagers, drove her into a deep depression. She could not bear the whispers and pitying glances, nor could she imagine a future where she and Adanna could thrive. One cold, moonless night, Amina made a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She wrapped Adanna in a thin wrapper, carried her deep into the forest, and left her there. As she walked away, she told herself it was for the best, that Adanna would be better off in the hands of fate than in a life of hardship and scorn. But as the sound of her daughter's cries faded into the distance, Amina's heart broke into 1,000 pieces. Adanna's cries echoed through the forest, but no one came. The cold night air beat at her tiny body, and the sounds of the wilderness surrounded her. The forest was alive with the chirping of crickets, the hooting of owls, and the rustling of leaves in the wind. But to Adanna, it was a world of darkness and fear. But fate, it seemed, had not abandoned her. Deep in the forest lived an old couple, Chokomika and Neka. They had left the village many years ago, choosing a life of solitude away from the judgmental eyes of society. Chokomika was a skilled hunter and herbalist, while Neka was a weaver and storyteller. They had no children of their own, but they had each other, and they were content with their simple life. That night, as they sat by the fire outside their small hut, they heard a faint cry in the distance. At first, they thought it was the wind, but the cry grew louder and more distinct. Chukwuemeka grabbed his walking stick and a lantern, and together, they followed the sound. What they found broke their hearts: a tiny baby, wrapped in a thin wrapper, lying on the cold forest floor. Her cries were weak, and her little body was shivering from the cold. Nneka immediately picked her up and cradled her in her arms. Who would do such a thing? Nneka whispered, tears streaming down her face. Chukwuemeka shook his head, his face grim. Only the gods know. But we cannot leave her here. She needs us. They took the baby back to their hut, warmed her by the fire, and fed her with the little goat's milk they had. As they cared for her, they noticed that her eyes did not respond to the light. It was clear that she was blind. We will call her Adanna, Nneka said, meaning her father's daughter. She is a gift from the gods, and we will raise her as our own. Chukwuemeka nodded in agreement. She will bring light into our lives, even if she cannot see it herself. And so, Adanna became a part of their family. Chukwuemeka and Nneka loved her as if she were their own child. They taught her everything they knew, and Adanna grew into a beautiful, confident young woman. Though she could not see, Adanna's other senses became extraordinarily sharp. She learned to navigate the forest by the sound of the wind, the scent of the trees, and the feel of the earth beneath her feet. Chukwuemeka taught her to identify plants and animals by their sounds and smells, while Nneka taught her to sing and weave stories. Adanna's blindness became her strength. She could hear the slightest rustle of leaves, smell the faintest scent of rain in the air, and feel the vibrations of the earth beneath her feet. She learned to trust her instincts and her senses, and she became one with the forest. Nneka often told her stories of the village and the people who lived there. She spoke of the gods and the spirits of the forest, and she taught Adanna to respect and honor them. Adanna loved these stories, and she would often ask Nneka to tell them again and again. As Adanna grew older, she began to explore the forest on her own. She would walk for hours, feeling the trees and listening to the sounds of the animals. She felt safe and free in the forest, and she knew that it was her home. One day, Adanna's life in the forest was peaceful and fulfilling. She had grown into a beautiful young woman, with a heart full of love and a spirit full of strength. Though she could not see, she saw the world in her own way through the sounds, smells, and feelings that surrounded her. The village of Ile-Ife had always been a place of tradition and simplicity. But when the old king passed away, his son, Obinna, took the throne. Obinna was young, strong, and full of ambition. He wanted to bring prosperity to the village and ensure that his people were happy and well-fed. But there was one thing missing in his life: a queen. Obinna had searched far and wide for a woman who could match his spirit and compassion. He had met many beautiful and intelligent women, but none of them felt right. He wanted someone who could understand him, someone who could be his partner in ruling the village. But so far, he had not found her. One day, Obinna decided to go hunting in the forest. He needed some time away from the village to clear his mind. He took his bow and arrow, called his hunting dogs, and set off into the dense forest. The forest was a place of mystery and beauty, filled with the sounds of birds, the rustling of leaves, and the occasional roar of a distant animal. As Obinna walked deeper into the forest, he heard something unusual: a voice. It was soft and melodic, like the sound of a gentle stream. He followed the sound, curious to see who could be singing in the middle of the forest. The voice grew louder as he approached a clearing, and there, sitting by a stream, was the most beautiful woman he had ever seen. She had dark, smooth skin and long, braided hair. Her face was serene, and her voice was like music to his ears. But what struck him the most was her confidence. She sat there, her fingers trailing in the water, completely at ease in the forest. Obinna approached her slowly, not wanting to startle her. When he was close enough, he cleared his throat and said, "Who are you?" The woman turned her head towards him, her unseeing eyes seeming to look straight into his soul. "I am Adanna," she replied, her voice steady and calm. "And who are you, stranger?" "I am Obinna, the king of Ile-Ife." Adanna smiled. "A king in the forest. What brings you here?" Obinna was struck by her grace and confidence. He sat down beside her and began to talk. He told her about his life in the village, his dreams for the future, and his search for a queen. Adanna listened intently, her face showing no sign of fear or hesitation. As they talked, Obinna learned about Adanna's life in the forest. She told him about her adoptive parents, Chukwumeka and Nneka, and how they had raised her with love and kindness. She spoke of her blindness, not as a weakness, but as a strength that had taught her to see the world in a different way. Obinna was amazed by her resilience and wisdom. He had never met anyone like her before. By the time he left the forest that day, he knew he had found his queen. Obinna brought Adanna to the village, and they were married in a grand ceremony. The villagers were in awe of their new queen. She was beautiful, kind, and wise, and they quickly grew to love her. Adanna's blindness did not hinder her in any way. In fact, it made her even more remarkable. She could sense things that others could not, and her intuition was always right. As queen, Adanna worked alongside Obinna to bring prosperity to the village. She introduced new farming techniques, helped the villagers build better homes, and even started a school for the children. The people of Ile-Ife adored her, and she became known as the Queen of Light. But while Adanna's life in the village was fulfilling, there was a part of her that could not forget the past. She often thought about her mother, Amina, and the night she had been abandoned in the forest. The memory of that night was like a shadow that followed her everywhere she went. One day, during a feast at the palace, Adanna heard a voice that sent chills down her spine. It was a voice she had not heard in years, but one she could never forget, the voice of her mother, Amina. Amina had remarried a wealthy trader named Emeka, and they had 2 children together. Over the years, Amina had tried to bury the memory of Adanna deep within her heart. But as the years passed, she could not escape the guilt that gnawed at her soul. When Amina and her family were summoned to the palace for the feast, she had no idea what to expect. She had heard stories about the new queen, but she had never seen her. As she entered the grand hall, she was struck by the queen's presence. There was something familiar about her, but Amina could not place it. As the queen spoke, Amina felt a chill run down her spine. The voice, it was so familiar, but she couldn't tell. Adanna could recognize her mother's voice. Though she could not see her face, she knew it was Amina. The memories of that cold night in the forest came flooding back, and a fire ignited within her. She had found her mother, and she would make her pay for the abandonment that had haunted her all her life. Adanna's revenge was not impulsive or reckless. It was calculated and precise. She knew that she had to be careful, as she did not want to jeopardize her position as queen or her relationship with Obinna. But she also knew that she could not let her mother go unpunished. The first step in Adanna's revenge was to ensure that Amina's family faced hardship. She used her influence as queen to block Emeka's trading routes and seize his goods. Emeka's business began to fail, and their wealth dwindled. Amina's children fell ill, and no medicine seemed to help. The once proud family was reduced to poverty, and Amina could not understand why misfortune had befallen them. Adanna's revenge was not just about causing pain, it was about making her mother understand the depth of the suffering she had endured. She wanted Amina to feel the same fear and helplessness that she had felt as a child, abandoned in the forest. The days following the feast at the palace were filled with tension and unease for Amina. She couldn't shake the feeling that the queen, Adanna, was her long-lost daughter. The voice, the way she carried herself, and the subtle hints Adanna had dropped during their brief encounter all pointed to one undeniable truth. But Amina needed proof. She needed to be sure. One evening, as Amina sat by the fire in her small, crumbling home, she noticed something glinting in the dim light. It was a small, intricately woven bracelet lying on the floor near the hearth. Her heart skipped a beat as she picked it up. The bracelet was old, its colors faded, but she recognized it immediately. It was the same bracelet she had tied around Adanna's tiny wrist the night she abandoned her in the forest. Tears welled up in Amina's eyes as she clutched the bracelet to her chest. The guilt she had buried for so long came rushing back, overwhelming her. She had tried to convince herself that she had done the right thing, that Adanna was better off in the hands of fate. But now, faced with the possibility that her daughter was alive and thriving, Amina could no longer deny the truth. She had made a terrible mistake, and she needed to make amends. The next morning, Amina gathered her courage and went to the palace. She begged the guards for an audience with the queen, claiming it was a matter of great importance. After much pleading, they finally agreed to let her in. When Amina was brought before Adanna, she fell to her knees and wept. "My daughter," she cried, her voice trembling with emotion. "I am so sorry. I was weak and afraid, and I made a terrible mistake. Please, forgive me." Adanna sat silently on her throne, her face unreadable. She had waited years for this moment, and now that it was here, she wasn't sure how to feel. The anger and pain she had carried for so long were still there, but so was a glimmer of compassion. She had always known that one day she would confront her mother, but she hadn't expected it to be so soon. "You left me to die, mother," Adanna said finally, her voice steady but laced with emotion. "But I survived. I found love and kindness in the forest, and I became who I am today because of it. I do not forgive you for what you did, but I forgive you for who you were. You were broken, just as I was. But we are both stronger now." Amina looked up at her daughter, tears streaming down her face. "Can we start anew?" Adanna reached out and took her mother's hand. "Yes, we can." From that day on, Amina and her family were welcomed into the palace. Adanna ensured that they were cared for, and over time, the wounds of the past began to heal. The mother and daughter were united once again, and the light that Adanna had brought into the world shone brighter than ever. But the road to forgiveness was not an easy one. Amina had to confront the pain and guilt she had carried for so long, and Adanna had to learn to let go of the anger that had fueled her for years. It was a journey that required patience, understanding, and a willingness to forgive. Adanna's first act of reconciliation was to restore Emeka's trading business. She lifted the restrictions she had placed on his routes and even provided him with financial support to get back on his feet. Emeka was grateful, but he couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. He had always known that Amina had a past, but he had never imagined it would come back to haunt them in such a way. Amina's children, Chidi and Ngozi, were also welcomed into the palace. Adanna took a special interest in them, ensuring that they received the best education and care. She saw in them the innocence and potential that she had once had, and she was determined to give them the opportunities she had been denied. As the days turned into weeks, Amina and Adanna began to rebuild their relationship. They spent hours talking, sharing stories, and getting to know each other again. It was a slow and sometimes painful process, but it was also healing. For the first time in years, Amina felt a sense of peace, and Adanna felt a sense of closure. One evening, as they sat together in the palace garden, Adanna turned to her mother and said, "Tell me about that night. Why did you do it?" Amina sighed, her eyes filled with regret. "I was young and scared," she said softly. "I had just lost your father, and I didn't know how I was going to raise you on my own. The villagers were cruel, and I couldn't bear the thought of you growing up in a world that would never accept you. I thought I was doing the right thing. Adanna nodded, her expression thoughtful. I understand, she said. But you should have fought for me. You should have believed in me. I know, Amina replied, her voice breaking. And I will regret it for the rest of my life. But I am so proud of the woman you have become. You are strong, kind, and wise, and you have brought so much light into this world. Adanna smiled, a genuine smile that reached her eyes. Thank you, Mother. That means more to me than you know. Adanna's legacy as the Queen of Light lived on long after her reign. Her story became a symbol of hope and resilience, inspiring countless others to overcome their own challenges and to find strength in their struggles. Amina, too, found redemption. She spent the rest of her life making amends for her past mistakes, and she cherished every moment she had with her daughter and grandchildren. Though the scars of the past remained, they served as a reminder of the power of forgiveness and the enduring bond between a mother and her child. And so, in the village of Ile-Ife, the tale of the blind queen and her mother became a legend, a story of love, loss, and the unbreakable spirit of the human heart.